Welcome to another West Main Worship Bite. In this week's lesson, I want to draw our attention to a very famous passage in the Gospel of John. It's called The Woman Caught in Adultery, John chapter 8. But before we get to that passage, I feel the need to address one small little matter concerning that text. If you have a more modern translation, most likely above the chapter of that passage, there's going to be this little parenthesis that says something to the effect, the earliest manuscripts do not contain these verses. And the reality is that's true. The earliest manuscripts do not contain this section, this set of scriptures, this particular story. And so a lot of people have drawn question to whether or not it should actually be in the Gospel of John or not. Now, no question, it was added later, probably in the Middle Ages, but this text had been around. It had been on some written document somewhere, and the story had been told over and over and over again. And it shouldn't surprise us that there are probably many stories about Jesus and things that he said and did that didn't make the final cut into the gospel. In fact, in John's gospel at the end, he says, I imagine if all the things Jesus did and said were written down, the world cannot contain all the books that would have to be written. The world cannot hold everything that Jesus said and did. It would be too much. So it should be surprising that there would be stories like this woman caught in adultery and what happened to her that would not have made it into the final canonical Gospels, but that doesn't make it any less true. And as we read through this text and experience it, it obviously is genuine. And I know that because anytime you read a passage about Jesus and it totally contradicts something that I would normally think or say or believe, that's a pretty good sign it's genuine. When Jesus goes against our human experience, when he goes against the human tendency, that's usually a genuine sign, a sign of authenticity that we're dealing with the Lord. And as we read through this text, I think that'll be obvious to you as well. So let's just read through the account and then we'll unpack and see what we can gain from it. This is the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 1. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who had heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. Everything in that passage screams Jesus. It's so genuine that I don't think there is one iota of a doubt that this is a part of the revelation of God. Among the many things I find fascinating about this passage is how it begins with this large crowd gathering around. A lot of people. It's almost a mob type scene in the sense that, here's Jesus and everyone's trying to listen to him and hear what he has to say. And all of a sudden these religious leaders come in. And remember, these religious leaders in the first century, they're not just religious leaders. Remember, the scribes and the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, were also the political leaders. Today we make this distinction, religious leaders, political leaders. But in Israel, they're one and the same. The religious leader is the political leader. And they, in essence, are prosecuting a case. Here's a woman who broke the law of Moses, broke the legal code, and the authorities are bringing her for trial. And they're going to ask Jesus, what would you do? Now, these religious leaders, as the text made very clear, didn't really care about the law as much as they cared about trapping Jesus. They wanted to have some way of accusing him. He was gaining too much popularity, too much power in their eyes. He threatened the status quo. And so they really had, on the surface of it, what looks like the perfect trap. Because they know Jesus is someone who's been forgiving sinners. He's mentioned that so many times. He hangs around prostitutes and tax collectors and all these other sinners, all the marginalized. And so they know his compassionate and merciful heart. And so now they have this woman caught in adultery, and they're going to know that he wants to forgive her. He's going to want to be merciful toward her. But if he does that in front of all these people, when she has clearly broken the law of Moses, she's broken the law. If he does that, now they have a basis of accusing him in front of all these people that are gathered around. So if he forgives her, he's a lawbreaker. On the other hand, if he gets scared and says, I can't break the law in front of all these people, and he says, that's right, stone her. Well, now he's not that loving, forgiving, merciful leader that he claims to be. So from their perspective, in terms of a trap, this is a win-win situation. No matter which way Jesus goes here, which path he chooses, they win. If he's forgiving, he breaks the law. If he follows the law, he's not so forgiving. So it looks to them like the perfect trap. So when they press this question upon him and say, what do you say? She broke the law. There's no denying that. The law says she should be stoned. Should she be stoned? He does an amazing thing. He was sitting, and what they would normally do as teachers in the laws, they would sit to teach. And they did that, by the way, because they're going to be teaching for a long time. So when next time you complain about me preaching too long, just remember I'm being like Jesus, right? And notice that I'm sitting down right now. And so Jesus decides not to answer their question immediately. He doesn't just spout off an answer. He gets up, bends down on the ground, begins drawing something on the ground. Now, a lot of people get caught up on, what did Jesus write? I don't think he bent down on the ground to write anything. He just happened to write on the ground because he bent down. I think he's just doodling. He's just, buying time there or killing time. And the text says they kept asking him, what are you going to say? What's your answer? And so you could almost feel the rage, the intensity increasing. The crowd wanting to know, what is he going to say? Is he going to forgive her? Is he going to break the law in front of the religious leaders who are charged with holding that law? Will he contradict what God actually said in Scripture? And so he just remains silent. And he's not looking at them. He's looking down. He's bent down. I think that's a very important piece to this story, because generally when we get in an argument with someone, we're looking right at them. Right? We're looking right at each other, and we tend to cast onto each other what we're thinking. I'll cast my anger onto you, and I'll read my anger in your eyes, and you'll read your anger in my eyes. But Jesus doesn't do that. He gets down on the ground. He's not going to engage this rage that they have. And after a little bit, he stands up, and he says this amazing thing. If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Now, this is an amazing thing. You have this crowd gathered around. And all of a sudden, Jesus takes the crowd, and essentially, things are getting smaller, right? You go from this crowd to now he's narrowed it down to the individual. If any one of you is without sin, then cast the first stone. Notice the individuality of that. So it's no longer a crowd decision. Right? You could hide behind a faceless crowd, but now he's going to make it very personal. All right, you're asking what I would do. I'm saying, well, you without sin, cast the first stone. And then the text says, at this, those who heard him began to go away one at a time, the older ones first. Why the older ones first? Because they have all this life experience and they can't hold on to self-righteousness. They know they're sinners. And they have to look at their own hearts and say, what would I want to happen to me? Do I deserve to die? Do I deserve to be stoned? Probably. I know I'm not a perfect person. I know I've done enough to deserve death. I've sinned against God as well. How can I now turn around and judge somebody else? And so the oldest ones first go away one at a time, right? So you go from a crowd to suddenly all these individuals. Maybe the younger ones held on a little longer because they had more arrogance and more stupidity. But eventually they too had to walk away, because I bet you there were plenty of people in that crowd that knew who those younger religious leaders were. And if one of those younger people dared to try to hold on to their self-righteousness and say, yeah, I'm not without sin, there'd be someone in that crowd that would say, oh yeah, buddy, I was there. I know what you did. So starting with the oldest down to the youngest, they all leave. And then it's this amazing thing. It says they all left until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Now, Jesus had no sin. If Jesus wanted to stone her, he could have. But then he says, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. This is extraordinary. I mean, you go from this crowd to suddenly it's just Jesus. Just Jesus and this woman. What was meant to be a trap for him, he now has taken all those who were trying to trap him, and they're gone. The woman who has been accused of adultery and has committed adultery, should be condemned, is told to go. She's not condemned. God in the flesh does not condemn her. That I just find so amazing, that Jesus could do this, that he could, it seems like an impossible situation to get out of, he totally reverses it. Now, I wonder if we were to take this passage and if, as an event and bring it into the modern world today, and this were to play out on social media, it was some sort of Facebook report, and they said, what do you think of this situation here? This woman broke the law, she deserves the death penalty, and this spiritual guru named Jesus, well, he didn't condemn her. He just said, he doesn't condemn her, go and leave your life of sin. How would that play out in our world today? I imagine you would have the law and order people would start typing away. You know what Jesus is doing here? He's promoting adultery. That's what Jesus is doing. I mean, the law is clear. You shouldn't commit adultery. It was a sin punishable by death. She committed it. She knew the risks. She took the risk. She broke the law. She deserves to die. So Jesus is condoning adultery here. He's defying law and order. I mean, that woman ruined someone else's marriage. So Jesus must not believe in the power of marriage. He doesn't believe in the sanctity of marriage. He's an adultery promoter. He promotes the broken marriages. He's some sort of liberal snowflake who doesn't believe in law and order. Now, maybe those religious leaders and political leaders, they were applying the law unevenly. Because let's be honest, the law was clear. The man was supposed to be there too. And so those leaders were corrupt. I'll give you that. But not all political leaders are bad. I mean, they're just a few bad apples here, okay? They should have read the law more clearly. They should have been more equal in their justice and had the man there as well. But no doubt the man and that woman should have been punished, because that's what the law says. They knew the law. They broke the law. I can see other people get on there and say, no, you know what? Jesus stood up to those powerful authorities and their abuse of power. He stood up for justice, social justice, and he did wonderful to forgive her, and he treated her as a human being, and he addressed her. And he did so good, except for the end. He was so forgiving of her, and he did the right thing, and he stood up to the powers that be, and he was perfect until the end when he said, leave your life of sin. When he said, I don't condemn you, go, that was good. But then when he pointed at her and said, but leave your life of sin, don't sin anymore. Well, you know what? She was just living her truth. That's just her truth. And maybe her truth is not your truth. And so, Jesus did pretty good up until that point. And so you can see people arguing all kinds of things about this case. But look at what Jesus does and doesn't do here. Jesus doesn't get into a debate about the law. He doesn't say to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, wait a minute, you're not following Deuteronomy chapter 22, because it clearly said the man is to be stoned too. So go get the man, bring him back, and we'll stone both of them. He doesn't get into a semantic debate about how the law was written or how to interpret it. Doesn't do that either. He doesn't get into issues of social justice. Doesn't do that either. He turns the spotlight on their own hearts and says, look into your heart. What do you see? How would you want to be treated? And so he looks at this woman who was caught in adultery, and he doesn't accept her adultery. He doesn't say, breaking up another marriage or being in an affair is fine. He tells her, leave your life of sin. Don't sin anymore. But notice he didn't make her sin the issue either. So he doesn't focus on the law and arguing about that. Doesn't argue about what the religious leaders are doing, saying, hey, you're just trying to trap me. He doesn't condone her sin, neither does he condemn it. Where does he put the focus? Neither do I condemn you. He sees her. It's his child. He doesn't want her living in sin. He's not going to condemn her because he's going to die for sin. Sin is off the table. She can suffer the consequences of that sin. There's no doubt about that. You keep living that way, it's going to hurt in your life. But he doesn't focus on the sin. He focuses on their relationship together. Makes it about him. When you think about what Jesus did here and how he spoke for this woman who had no one to speak for her, Jesus was doing what he always does. He speaks for those who cannot speak. He stands for those who no one stands for. He stands on the side of the marginalized, the downtrodden, the rejected. That's what the church is always supposed to do. And so we could take what Jesus did with the woman caught in adultery and think about what's happening in our society and our culture today. I'm thinking particularly of the situation involving George Floyd. So many people are saying, well, he did wrong. The police wouldn't have done anything and he wouldn't have been in this situation had he broken the law. And we start questioning the law and talking about the law and the corrupt police officers and the injustice and whether people can protest or not protest. And, all lives matter, not just black lives. We got to be Christian about this. And everyone has their opinion and they're arguing. Where is Jesus in all this? Where would Jesus put the focus? He would make it about him. And one thing I know about Jesus, he would point to the injustice. He would say what happened to George Floyd was evil. He wouldn't tolerate that. The church is always supposed to defend those who are defenseless, to speak up for those who are suffering injustice. Think about when Jesus says what a good shepherd does. He says that, let's say a shepherd had 100 sheep, and one of the sheep wanders away. Jesus says the good shepherd leaves the 99, and he goes after the one. Now, do all sheep lives matter? Of course they do. But Jesus said the 99 are fine. It's the one that's lost. It's the one that's hurting. The one that's missing the shepherd. That's the one I'm going to. The church, in large part, and I'm going to say the white church in particular, has lost this message. When we became the American church, instead of the church in America, that's when corruption happens. Anybody who thinks racism hasn't affected the Church of Christ doesn't know Church of Christ history. If you go back in our Restoration movement, which Church of Christ comes out of, there are two leaders in particular that are important to talk about here. There's Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. When these two men got together, this is where you get the Restoration movement forming and where the Churches of Christ come from. Now, when that happened, something to know about Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. They both owned slaves. And as they grew in their Christianity, they realized this is wrong. And so they let their slaves go. The difference between them was this. Barton Stone always spoke about the evil of slavery, called it out clearly. Alexander Campbell, not as much. He wouldn't do that. He got rid of his slaves, but he wouldn't come out and condemn it. And that tension has always been in the Churches of Christ and the Restoration movement. And as you get into the 1800s, sadly and tragically, the Churches of Christ split into the black Churches of Christ and the white Churches of Christ. There was one figure, David Lipscomb, who was very much against that. But even his university that was named after him eventually became highly segregated. No blacks could go there. In fact, in the Church of Christ, you ended up with Southwestern Christian University, which is an all-black Church of Christ university, because they couldn't go to the other Churches of Christ. They couldn't go to Abilene Christian. They couldn't go to Harding. They couldn't go to Freed-Hardeman. Blacks were not allowed. The Churches of Christ became segregated. And it's well documented in our history. I came from, when I lived in Boston, you could still see the remnants of that. As you were closer to the inner city of Boston, the Churches of Christ were black. As you got further away from the city and got into the suburbs, the Churches of Christ became white. That's not by accident. The Churches of Christ simply reflected the culture around them. We became the American church instead of the church in America. Now, does that mean everybody was racist? No. But we ended up reflecting the racism that is in the culture. And so we're blind often to these cultural and systemic factors that surround us. We're blind to systemic issues. We just say, well, it's just an incident. It was a bad incident here with George Floyd. It doesn't represent all police. No, it doesn't represent all police. But to say there's not systemic injustice would be blind. Of course there is. Sometimes we say, well, there's always a few bad apples in the barrel. Let's not throw out all the apples. Just throw out the bad ones. Okay, I get that. But here's the thought. What if it's not a few bad apples? What if the barrel is bad? There's something about the barrel that allows bad apples to exist in it. You know, when George Floyd had that knee placed on him for 8.5 minutes, there were plenty of other officers standing around. Do you think that was the first time something like this ever happened? What was going on in the system that allowed bad apples to exist? That's the question. The Church of Jesus Christ is supposed to be standing up to this, speaking to power, like Jesus did. But what happened to Jesus when he spoke to the powers that be? They crucified him. And Jesus said in the Gospel of John, if they persecuted me, what do you think they're going to do to you? But if you're the church in America, yes, you'll be marginalized and you'll be persecuted. But if we become the American church and we love power and money and authority and political influence, then we're not going to speak for the marginalized. Then we are going to get corrupt. And to say that none of that history has affected us would be ignorant. It has. It still has. It's often said that Sunday morning is the most segregated day of the week, because that's when blacks go to black churches, whites go to white churches. Are there exceptions? Of course. But exceptions, that's what they are. They're exceptions to the norm. So in the midst of all this chaos going on around us right now, let us be like Jesus and point to the evil. Say, yes, this is evil. But let us talk about the love of Christ and how that's going to reach every human heart and how we need to speak, especially for those who have suffered injustice. I have gone through a personal transformation on this subject myself. For years, I would have laughed at the idea of white privilege. I would have said, that's a joke. And then when I went to seminary, it was in Boston, I had to go, the Gordon Conwell, where I went to seminary, had 2 campuses. One in Hamilton, which is up in the North Shore, suburbs of Boston, affluent and white. Then the other campus they had was downtown Boston. And I went to the downtown campus because I worked during the day and the classes at the downtown campus were at night. So that's what allowed me to go to seminary. So I'd work during the day and then go to school at night. My very first class, I didn't know this till I got there, I walk in, over 100 students in this class. I was one of 2 white people in that room. This is one of the best experiences of my life. I never was a minority ever in my life. It was the first experience I ever had where the majority color was not white. And as I got to hear their stories and hear their experiences, I realized, wow, I have not experienced anything like this. You live in a different universe than what I live in. And the church I went to was predominantly white because it was in the rich white suburb. So when I moved there, it's not that I'm racist. I was looking for a job. They were hiring. I got hired. I lived in that community. It's a white community. I'm white. It never dawned on me all the privileges and advantages I was being given there until I was outside of that context. The church, if it becomes the American church, will never see this. It can't. It's too blind. It's like trying to explain water to a fish. You can't grasp it. It's just all around it. I just want us to be clear about something. We need to be able to stand with Jesus, with the marginalized. But when we do that, and if we do that, you're not going to be applauded. And the majority powers and the powers that be will not like it. They didn't like it when Jesus did it. And he said, if they crucified me, if they persecuted me, what do you think they're going to do to you? So at some point, maybe we have to do a little heart check here and ask ourselves, have we become the American church more than the church that's in America? Have we allowed within the Restoration movement black churches of Christ to form and white churches of Christ to form? How do we bridge that gap? How do we listen to these voices? Maybe people are not doing everything perfectly politically. I don't know what that even means. And I don't have any answers to give you about how to solve all these problems. But I know a conversation has to start. And I know that you have to start with those who have no power. I know you have to start with those who are experiencing injustice. And we have to start changing that. As hard as that may be, we are called to it. Jesus was crucified standing up to the powers that be. And so we may lose some privilege if we stand up for those who have no one to stand for them. But Jesus says, stand with me, and that's where he stands.